For Chapter 6, we'll be talking about cognitive change. The word cognitive or cognition you may have heard before, and essentially it's talking about thinking and reasoning, understanding the world, and how we construct our knowledge. So in this chapter, we'll be talking about how children's thinking changes over time. And the first approach that we'll be talking about is Jean Piaget's cognitive developmental perspective. So Piaget was the first scientist to really examine children's thinking and reasoning and come up with a theory about how it changes qualitatively, so going through different stages over time. Importantly, he suggested that children are active explorers and they learn in their world by experimenting and trying to build their own understanding of what's going on in the world. And just, I think one really good example of this is a child who is old enough to be sitting in a high chair, right, playing with toys at his high chair. And what's pretty typical is for young kids at that age to take every toy and then drop it off the side of their high chair. And it just drives mama crazy because she has to bend down and give those toys back to the infants. But what they're doing is they're experimenting. What happens when I throw this over the side? Right? They throw a soft toy and it doesn't make a noise, and they throw a hard toy and it does make a noise. So they're trying to learn about the properties of objects and how those objects react to their actions upon it. So Piaget observed his own children when he developed his theory, and he noticed that his kids were making some of the same errors in reasoning and errors in understanding the world at the same ages. So he came up with the idea that perhaps these were very specific, predictable stages that kids went through as they aged. Again, he viewed children as active participants, and he outlined 4 stages of development that we'll be going through. But before we get into that, let's talk about the processes that are used in constructing knowledge. We'll talk about schemas, this way of understanding and interacting with the world. You can think of them kind of like concepts. Assimilation and accommodation, and then also disequilibrium and equilibration are all some key terms that we'll be talking about here. So this helps us adapt. We encounter information, construct knowledge about our understanding of that information, and then sometimes that information, new information comes in and doesn't fit, so we have to change our understanding and our knowledge about the world. So this is us growing and learning as we gain new experiences. So let's begin with schemas. Schemas are concepts, ideas, ways of understanding, interacting with the world. You can think of these as the building blocks of mental representations. Now, what does that mean? Mental, think in your mind, and representation. So a representation of something that's on the outside world or of an idea, but instead it's in your mind. So kind of in the center figure here, you see that there are several shapes and they all have 4 sides. And then beneath the bar, there's a bunch of shapes and they don't have 4 sides. So that could be one simple concept of 4-sided shapes. Now, the very first concepts that infants develop are behavioral schemes. So infants first have reflexes where they don't think about something, their body just automatically reacts to a stimulus. We talked about that in a previous chapter. So for example, if you put a nipple in a baby's mouth, they will automatically start to suck on it. Now that's a reflex at first, but then very quickly they start to learn the idea, the concept of sucking, and they can modify that reflex and suck in different ways depending on the shape of the nipple. And they can suck in response to being excited, or they can suck simply because it's pleasurable. So they gain control over their reflex, and then they develop this concept of sucking behavior. So behavioral schemes are these physical activities in infancy, like sucking, looking, grasping an object. And in mental schemes, these develop a little bit more in childhood. Problem-solving strategies, plan of action, classifying objects, what is an animal, you know, what are cats, and we'll be talking about that in just a moment. Now, our schemes are organized. So we have higher level schemes. So for example, the category of fruit contains the scheme for orange and banana and apple. So we would say that fruit is a higher level scheme in relation to those other schemes, and they fit within it. So think of it like categories and subcategories, and we're often reorganizing our schemes as we learn new information. For example, cucumbers. Are they vegetables or fruits? They're actually fruits. How about tomatoes? Vegetables or fruits? They're fruits. Fruits have seeds. And you may have categorized them as vegetables because we don't cook them the same way. So if you're talking about a culinary classification, we would consider tomatoes to be more like a vegetable. We would treat them differently. You wouldn't put tomatoes in a fruit salad, right? But in terms of our taxonomy, because they have seeds, they're considered to be fruits. And learning that, you might have to reorganize your structural system and put them into a different category than where they were before. So what we're doing is we're adapting. This involves changing to meet situational demands, essentially a term for learning. And we have two processes for this: assimilation and accommodation. Process through which schemes are altered or schemes are used to interpret new information. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of what it's like to be a child. It's probably been a while since you've encountered something that you just had no idea what it was. I mean, by the time you're in your late teens, early 20s, you've seen most animals, right? I mean, of course, there are very exotic creatures that you are unfamiliar with when you go to the zoo, but in terms of your everyday life, you're not often encountering something that is completely different from anything that you've seen before. So I did my best to try to find a couple examples to make it feel as though you're encountering something new for the first time. All right, so what is this? What do you think that is? Give you a moment to think about it. Now, students often guess that it's broccoli. They may guess that it's a neuron. It's not. It does not match the shape of a neuron. They may suggest that it's a tree. What it is, it's a drawing of a basket star. It's a type of brittle starfish. And you see some interesting pictures here of a diver with a basket star covering his face. So quite different, right? You're probably not thinking about a starfish looking like that and having all of these different branches and arms. All right, so usually when I say starfish, and I have to laugh because before when I said, what comes to mind when you think of starfish, my students would say, oh, the orange starfish with the 5 points. And that's what the picture shows on the bottom left-hand side. Now when I say what comes to mind when you hear the word starfish, you know what students say? Patrick. They say Patrick from SpongeBob SquarePants. So now the typical orange 5-pointed star is probably what comes to mind because that's, I'd say, what you're most likely to encounter in Southern California, in children's books, in TV shows. It seems to be like a pretty typical starfish. Over on the right-hand side in this slide, you see a purple starfish with something like 20 arms. It's a starfish, but it's very different. And then the one on the bottom right has 5 arms, but it's really flexible and almost has this octopus-like appearance to it. It's not the strong starfish like we're used to. Now, you may begin life with seeing that star, the 5-pointed star, and are told it's a starfish, but then your parents take you to the aquarium and you see these other 2 very different starfishes at the aquarium. And what you have to do is update the information. So what you may go through is either interpreting what you see using your existing information of starfish, or you may have to create a new category if that's completely different. So let me give you another example here. What's this? Any guesses? This is a Brazilian 3-banded armadillo, right? Some of you may have thought it's some type of a ball. Maybe you've seen an armadillo before, but that's kind of strange, right? So wow, this might be a whole new thing. And so maybe you've never seen an armadillo before. So now you have to create a category and develop your understanding. and create your knowledge surrounding that armadillo. So let's talk about what's going on here. Let's say that you are a young kid. You have had a couple of cats in your family, and so you kind of have this idea of what a cat is, right? You've seen these 5 cats in the pictures up at the top, and so you learn information about cats. Well, they've got pointy ears, they meow, they walk and jump, and they like fish and dairy, right? That's pretty typical. So now when you encounter a new furry thing with pointy ears, like this, and this is actually my cat, you're going to assimilate this cat and interpret what you're seeing based on your information that you already have about cat. So you're integrating a new experience into a pre-existing schema. Cats can also be mostly white. Cats can also have orange on them, right? So you're incorporating this new cat into your overall information about cat, and also you're using your information that you have about what cats are and labeling this new cat because of it. Now, kids use this assimilation quite a bit, but they don't always use it consistently, or that correctly is perhaps the right term. So you may have known a young kid who has the word truck, and so any vehicle is called a truck. That's a truck. A car is a truck. Ambulance is a truck. A bicycle is a truck, right? And what they're doing is they have this category truck, and they're just using that information to interpret what they're seeing. But over time, they're going to realize, wait a minute, these are different things, and they'll have to create a new category for car. But when all they're doing is using this pre-existing schema for truck or pre-existing schema for cat and making sense of what they're seeing, we would call that assimilation. All right, the other process here is accommodation. So we've got our known information about cats, we've got lots of cats in the family, and then we encounter this furry thing. Well, it doesn't have pointy ears, and it doesn't make that meowing sound. It walks and it jumps, but it's different. I mean, puppies are kind of, right, bouncy and clumsy, and cats are very agile, and they can jump all the way up onto a counter. So they move differently, even though they both walk and jump. And then we've got likes fish and dairy. Well, I don't know about you guys, but most dogs will eat anything. So this may change your understanding. And if we see that this new thing in front of us, this new furry thing, is so different from our category of cats, what we'll have to do is create a new category, and it will be called dog. So now every time an infant encounters a new animal, they evaluate that animal in relation to these existing schemes. So, you know, we encounter a whale. Does it fit into a cat category or a dog category? Of course not. So we have to create a new category. So accommodation is adapting, modifying, or creating this new schema when information doesn't fit into it. So it could be creating a brand new schema for dog when you encounter a dog for the first time, but also it could be an adjustment of an existing schema. So I showed you all those different types of starfish, and so you may have to adjust what your idea of a starfish is and expand it to include these different types, like the basket star, which is much different. So you know, when you see an animal, right, here we've got a bunny, right, we recognize that now, but young kid, their first time seeing it, they don't know that. So they're asking themselves, is this a cat? Is this a dog? We would call these counter examples. They don't fit with our pre-existing schema. This makes us feel disequilibrium. I don't really know something. I don't know how this fits. I don't know how to make sense of this. We don't like that feeling. We like to have everything fit nicely into categories and have all of our information match up and be able to make sense of the world. So we have that intrinsic need to go from disequilibrium to equilibrium, that balance between assimilation and accommodation. And this need to have everything make sense and have a good understanding of the world is what leads to change over time and a cognitive shift to the next stage of thought. So let's talk about these 4 stages of cognitive development. Again, we're still in Piaget's theory. Each stage is qualitatively different, so it's of a different quality, a different type or way of thinking. Transitions are built by experience with the world and trying to make sense of your world. Earlier stages are the foundation for later stages, so we go in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't skip around. All children pass through in the same order, but not all children reach the stages at exactly the same age, and some adults never quite reach the formal operational stage, that last stage. So let's begin with the sensory motor stage. This is from birth to about 2 years. And just thinking about the name, sensory motor, right? Sensory, your senses, your touch and your sight and your hearing, and then motor, your motor actions, your movement. So you're learning about the world by seeing and feeling and touching and acting upon it. A major accomplishment by the end of this stage is mental representation, thinking about an object using mental pictures. So this would be having the idea of a pacifier in my mind, even though the pacifier doesn't exist. Now, there are several sub-stages within the sensory motor stage. We'll go over each of these briefly. The first substage is just simple reflexes. When newborns use reflexes like sucking or the palmar grasp to react to a stimulus that they experience. And they're simply learning about the world through reflexes. They automatically suck on a bottle nipple and then they get milk out of it. So they learn about that object that when it's sucked on, it provides milk. Substage 2, primary circular reactions. This is 1 to 4 months of age. So circular reactions are the repetition of an action and its response. So they repeat pleasurable actions in order to reproduce something that's interesting. So for example, they will kick, or they will bring their hand up to their mouth and suck on their hand, and they'll do it purposefully simply because it was pleasurable. It involves their own body parts, not outside objects quite yet. And it may begin by accident, like the infant accidentally sucks on their hands, and then they try to repeat it, suck on their hand or their finger over again, because it seems to be something that's interesting and pleasurable. Substage 3, secondary circular reactions. These are repetitions of actions that trigger responses in some external environment, so outside the baby's body. So this is a pattern of repetition oriented toward making interesting events occur in the infant's environment. So this could be shaking of a rattle because just the sound of the rattle itself is interesting. Substage 4, coordination of secondary circular reactions, 8 to 12 months, is coordinating 2 secondary circular reactions in order to achieve a goal. So this could be something like moving dad's hand in order to get the toy, the rattle that's underneath there, and so shaking the rattle. So the pleasurable thing wasn't moving dad's hand, instead it was shaking the rattle, but there were 2 actions coordinated in order to achieve that goal. Object permanence is a really important advancement during this stage, and this is the understanding that objects continue to exist even if they're outside of one's own sensory awareness. And Piaget tested this by hiding toys underneath a blanket. So he would take a toy, shake a rattle, hide it under the blanket, and then would look to see if a baby would lift the blanket up in order to get the toy. You can test this yourself if you have an infant around you, and just think about a very typical experience that parents have going out to eat with their young infants, and they sit them down at the table, and you know, if it's at a place where the table is already set, well, the infant will almost immediately want to go toward that, you know, shiny, sharp object that they shouldn't have, you know, forks or knives. And it's interesting. They want to play with it. But of course, babies can't play with knives and forks. So the parents will try to put it away. Now, if they can still see it, they'll still kind of whine for it and reach for it. So then the mom might cover it with a napkin. If the baby still is whining for it and reaching for it, that means that they have that image in their mind of that that fork or of that knife, that they remember it's there, they can think about what it looks like, and they still want it. In younger infants who don't have object permanence, when you hide the fork, it will almost be like it never existed at all. They will kind of move on very quickly and not be very upset by it. So that object permanence is that beginning of having a mental representation inside one's mind. And it's not just of objects, but of people and of events, that things happen beyond your immediate awareness of them. Substage 5, tertiary circular reactions. This is active, purposeful, trial and error exploration for new discoveries. And this is what I was describing before with young infants throwing toys off of the high chair and then observing what happens when I throw this toy or that toy. How does it react differently to hitting the ground? So they become little scientists at this age. And then substage 6, mental representation. So this is the ability to use symbols such as words and mental pictures to represent objects and actions in their memories. They really do get to a much more sophisticated level of understanding, not just understanding that something exists, but really developing those concepts and also words and symbols. So I want you to think about this for a moment. Our language is symbolic. When I say the word cat, the sound that comes out of my mouth, cat, that sound has no relation to the furry thing that meows, right? It's just our agreed upon symbol for that idea of cat. So this stage shows that more advanced use of symbols and being able to represent something with something else. Being able to use a block of wood and pretending that it's a car or a telephone, right? So that's a symbol for something else. It's representational. So we see advancements in language and also in play at this age. Now, Piaget suggested that object permanence didn't come about until about 8 months of age, but more recent research has shown that, in fact, we see infants show quite a bit more understanding of object permanence. It's just that his task might have been too difficult. Remember, his task required young infants to reach over and pick up the blanket to uncover the toy to demonstrate that he understood that the toy still existed. So that requires a coordination of all of that motor movement in addition to the memory and understanding of the world. So another way to test this is with what are called violation of expectation tasks. These are tests in which there appears to be some violation of a physical law. So not only are we testing infants' object permanence, understanding that something continues to exist even when it's not visible, but also we're testing infants' understanding of the physical properties of objects. So this is one example of René Baillargeon's drawbridge study on the right-hand side. And let me get my cursor out here quick. Okay, so we've got an experimental condition and a control condition. And I'm just going to bring your attention down to the control condition here at first. So what we're showing is we're looking at a side view. So the baby would be sitting here for this test, okay, always to the right side of the figure. The baby is looking on, okay? So here, first it's habituation. This would be like if I was sitting at a table and I had a textbook laying flat in front of me. And then the textbook lifts up and appears to do kind of like it lifts up and the bottom stays attached to the table and then it flips over onto its back, okay? So it's going up and then back. That's nothing too exciting. I don't notice that anything should be able to stop it or get in the way. It's simply an object that is lifting up and then going down. So think a drawbridge. But on this upper screen here, we see a possible test where the drawbridge comes up and then it gets stopped. There's a block here. So the baby is sitting here. So when they first are looking, they can see that there's a block. So when this drawbridge lifts up and stops, everything makes sense because there was something there blocking it. This is the impossible test where the child sees the block and the drawbridge comes up, but then it goes all the way down to the ground. And what they do is they have this block actually fall down into the table. They've got like a secret compartment. So it actually retracts into the table. Now, infants are sitting here. So when the drawbridge lifts up and the drawbridge is up vertical like this, their view of the block is obscured. So from their perspective, the block still exists and it should not be able to go down all the way flat against the table because something is there blocking it. Now, babies, if they have an understanding of object permanence, they will look longer at the impossible event. Like, what? What is going on? This doesn't make any sense. And adults do this as well. If someone's walking across the room in front of you and their feet are attached to the floor, it's boring, you don't bother looking at it. But if they're hovering 3 feet off the floor, you're gonna stare longer. It doesn't make sense. So infants show that same response. And this is how we can tell that infants are surprised because they remember that there's a block behind the drawbridge and therefore it should not go all the way down to the table. So by using this technique, René Baillargeon was able to determine that infants as young as 4 months of age show some of this understanding that an object continues to exist even when it's obscured, even when an infant can't see it. Okay, so again, I mentioned that infants can display object permanence from Piaget's perspective, from Piaget's testing, by covering an object and then asking the baby to uncover it. Now, babies show kind of a very typical error. It's called the A not B error. And this is when infants are unable to uncover a toy behind a barrier. Yet when they observe, they are able to uncover a toy behind a barrier. So they are shown the ball go under the towel, they lift up the towel, and they find it. So that's in spot A. Now when they're shown the ball and the ball is placed under spot B, under the other towel, what babies will do is they'll continue looking under cloth A for it. So they'll make an error. They'll keep looking where they found it before. So infants seem to understand the correct location of the object, but they can't keep themselves from reaching for place A because of neural and motor immaturity. And it could also be because infants can't restrain the impulse to repeat a behavior that was rewarded before. There's a little bit of this perseveration going on. Deferred imitation tests are a way to measure infants' understanding of a behavior and memory for a behavior. So for example, I could show a baby a toy, a fairly complex toy, use it myself, but not actually allow the child to copy or imitate the object right then. I bring them back a week or two later and then show them the object to see if they remember what I did with it. So that's what we mean by deferred imitation, ability to repeat an act performed some time ago. And this requires acting on the basis of stored representations or memories, that they remember what I did before. So Piaget believed infants under 18 months couldn't engage in deferred imitation because they lack mental representation abilities. But contemporary research shows that infants can engage in deferred imitations. So that's one major criticism of Piaget's at least timing of some of these skills and abilities. The core knowledge perspective is an alternative theory. It explains that infants are born with innate knowledge systems or core domains that enable rapid early development and adaptation. Some evidence for this: well, infants learn so quickly and encounter such a great amount of sensory information that there must be some pre-wired evolutionary understanding, including the ability to learn rules. There must be something at work here, because infants do not seem to struggle with learning about the physics of the world. They pick up on things pretty fast within just a couple months of life. All right, moving on to the pre-operational stage. This is ages 2 to 6 years, and there's this leap in the use of symbolic thinking, and it permits children to use language, to interact with others, to play. I talked about these mental representations at the end of the sensory motor stage, and so now we see this blossoming of mental representations, including language, again, which is a symbolic form of communication. And they have such great imagination. Now kids are you know, learning about the world and have ideas and understandings about the world, but then they also have this magical thinking. So this is reflected in a lot of their art and drawings and beliefs. Kids at this age are very much afraid of monsters, and no matter how much you rationalize to them, there is no monster under the bed, there is no monster in your closet, everything is going to be fine. Because they have this magical type of thinking, they don't believe you, no matter, so no matter how much logic you use, it won't fight their magical beliefs. So one strategy for fighting off monsters is to have a bottle of Febreze and just call it monster spray. And then Febreze their room, and then using a little bit of magic to counteract their magical beliefs can sometimes put them a little bit more at ease. So pre-operational thought is characterized by a few very specific ways of thinking. And the first one is egocentrism. This is difficulty in taking someone else's perspective. The child tends to view the world from his or her own perspective, assuming that other people share his or her feelings, knowledge, and even the physical view of the world. And we can test this using the 3 mountains task. I'll put a link to a video up on Canvas. And what you can see here from the picture is a teddy bear sitting on the opposite side of this almost like diorama from a child and an experimenter. And the experimenter will walk the child around the mountain so they can see everything that's there, and then say, what can the teddy bear see from his perspective? What can the teddy bear see? And a child who is egocentric will not say the teddy bear sees the tree, and instead the child will say the teddy bear sees the house, because the child sees the house, and so therefore the child assumes that the teddy bear also sees the house. So they're unable to take someone else's perspective. And kids will show this in a few kind of cute ways. They'll draw a picture, but then hold the picture up facing themselves and not to the person they're showing it to, because they think that if they can see it, then someone else may see it. Or they'll, call grandma up and say to grandma, oh, grandma, do you like the t-shirt that I'm wearing today? And they don't recognize that grandma's not there in person. She can't see what shirt you're wearing. So they think that whatever everyone else is seeing or feeling or thinking, that they are as well. And you can also see this reflected in the way that they speak about things. They'll often talk about something without actually telling you or what they're referring to. So you'll see this in the 3 Mountains video, where the young boy, when he's asked, what do you see, or what do you think I see? And he'll say things like this, that, right? He's not actually naming it. And so what he's assuming is that the person knows what he's referring to, because he knows what he's referring to. Quite fascinating. Pre-operational children also show animism, the belief that inanimate objects are alive and have feelings and intentions. They think that because they have intent and they have feelings, that other things do too, even if they have no life to them. So they will say things like, the tree pushed the leaf off and it fell and it got hurt, right? So giving life to the tree and to the leaf. They'll also demonstrate centration, this tendency to focus on one part of a stimulus or of a situation and exclude all others. We can test this in a few ways. First, the appearance-reality distinction. This is a task that requires children to distinguish what something appears to be from what it actually is. So we may show a child a cat, and then while it's halfway hidden behind a screen, put a dog mask on it, and then show the cat to the child. And the children will now say that it's a dog. We can also test appearance. Pre-operational children will also demonstrate irreversibility. They don't understand that reversing a process can often undo it and restore it to its original state. And what we're talking about is the opposite of conservation, the understanding that the quantity of substance is not transformed by the changes in its appearance. So Piaget came up with several different conservation tests of changing the shape of an object and then asking if the child believes that the number or mass has changed. So on the right-hand side, you see these different types. The first one being number. So here, the original presentation, they line up, you know, six coins on top and 6 coins on the bottom, so 2 rows of 6 coins each, and then transforms them and takes the top row and spreads them apart a bit. And then asks the child, now there are the same number, are there the same number of pennies in each row, or does one have more? Now, as adults, you can see, well, all you did was spread them apart. There are still only 6 pennies in each row. But a child will focus on just one part of a stimulus, again bringing this back to centration. They will focus instead on the width of the row and ignore the spaces in between, and they'll say that the top row has more. You can see an example with mass. You can do this with Play-Doh. You start out with 2 balls of Play-Doh. Is there the same amount of clay in each ball? And they'll say yes. And then you can kind of squish one out into a worm shape and the other stays into a ball shape. And then they'll ask, does one piece have more, or do they have the same? Kids in the pre-operational stage will say that now one has more. And usually they'll say that the snake or worm shape has more clay, even though they saw it transform. They think that the actual mass has changed. And then the last one here, we have 2 glasses of water or juice, the same height, and we'll ask them, do these glasses have the same amount? And they'll say yes. And then you pour one into a short fat glass or one into a tall skinny glass, right? So we change the shape, and pre-operational children will say that now one has more. And usually they'll focus on the height of the glass and say that the tallest one has the most. So they're lacking the understanding of conservation. And what's going on is they're not thinking in their minds that I could just pour the glass of water back into the other cup and it would be the same. Instead, they think that it has transformed and now it has a different amount than it did before. In the concrete operational stage, so this is the 3rd stage, from between about ages 6 to 11, children gain the ability to use logic to solve problems and have a better understanding of the physical world around them. So logical reasoning replaces intuitive reasoning, but it requires specific concrete examples. And I'll post a video demonstrating this in a young child. So they have logical reasoning. So for example, I can say, if I hit a hammer with a glass, what will happen? And the kid will say, the glass will break. Okay, so they'll understand that when a hammer hits a glass, it breaks. Now, I can give them this logic problem trick. So I can say, we've got 2 rules. When I hit a glass with a feather, the glass will break. That's a rule. And then I say, rule 2, I hit a glass with a feather. What happened? Now, adolescents and adults will kind of think for a moment and then be like, well, this is strange because feathers don't break glasses, but you said it was a rule. And so they're able to solve the logic problem and say, well, I guess it'll break. And kids in the concrete operational stage will not say that it broke, and instead they will say, no, nothing happened because feathers don't break glass. So they will hold on to this concrete definition of objects, and so they can solve a logic problem, right? The hammer and the glass doesn't exist in the real world. They're thinking about it in their minds. They can do that logic problem, but they can only do it if it actually applies to the real properties of objects. So conservation described earlier, they've achieved that at this stage. For example, object identity, the understanding that characteristics of an object don't change despite superficial changes in its appearance. They understand reversibility, that an object can return to its original state, so it undoes the superficial physical alterations by which it was changed, like pouring it into a different glass, a different shape. So most children can solve conservation problems by age 7 or 8. They understand classification. They can understand hierarchies and relationships between a general category and more specific categories. So, for example, if I show you these flowers along the bottom and I ask you, or ask a child, are there more daisies or flowers? Pre-operational children will say more daisies because daisies are daisies, they aren't flowers. Whereas concrete operational children will recognize that daisies can be categorized as daisies, but then also as flowers, and roses are also flowers. So they understand that hierarchy, that flower is a bigger category than daisies and roses, and so the correct answer is that there are more flowers. At this age too, they also develop the ability to order objects in a series, seriation, according to a physical dimension. So give them sticks all of different lengths and they're able to line them up from smallest to largest. Younger children in the pre-operational stage may line them up according to height, like they'll put the top of the sticks going from smallest to largest, but they'll ignore the bottom of it, and the bottom will be jagged. You'll see some that are longer than others. They also understand transitive inference, the ability to infer the relationship between two objects by understanding a third object. So, for example, if Sally is taller than Tommy, and Tommy is taller than Susie, then Sally is also taller than Susie, that type of transitive inference. So let's talk briefly about evaluating a concrete operational stage. Cultural factors play a significant role in the rate of cognitive development, especially in this stage, and what a child is exposed to. And also, the way that they perform on these concrete operational tests might be kind of an issue of how they were asked rather than children's abilities. Just to give you one example of this, for the conservation task, if I pour water into 2 glasses and I say, are they the same or different? And you say they're the same. And then I pour one into another glass and I say, are they the same or different? What may be going on is children recognize that this is a duplicate question. You're asking me again, so therefore I must have answered incorrectly the first time, and so they may change up their answer. So there may be some methodological issues with this. But regardless, you know, there is a significant role of education and cultural practices and what you're exposed to that helps with the development of this logical thinking and concrete reasoning. The last stage is the formal operational stage, beginning around 11 years old. And this involves the ability to think abstractly, logically, systematically, to reason about ideas. So now it's not just thinking about a dog, but it's thinking about all dogs in general, right? Not just my specific concrete dog that I have at home. They're able to think systematically and engage in more scientific thought as opposed to trial and error thought. So this is hypothetical deductive reasoning. And I give you the example on the right-hand side of a pendulum experiment. And so we can present children and adolescents with pendulums that vary with, let's see, we can have different pendulum sizes, so a small versus medium and large pendulum. We can also differ by how long the string is on the pendulum, and then also by how high up I pull the pendulum. And then we ask the question, what affects the speed of the pendulum? Younger kids in the concrete operational stage will approach a more trial and error type of solution that doesn't quite work with this experiment. And they'll do a medium pendulum with a long string and pull it back far, and then a small pendulum with a short string and then pull it back a short amount. And they don't understand that in order to systematically test this, you need to vary only one factor at a time and collect data and look at how the speed is affected by each of these individual factors. Those in the formal operational stage demonstrate what's called adolescent egocentrism, this heightened self-consciousness or self-awareness. You may have experienced this when you were in high school, feeling like all eyes were on you and people were judging you and thinking about you. And that really can be quite nerve-wracking. So there are kind of two aspects of this. The first one being an imaginary audience, believing that all others are as interested in you as you are. And teenagers may respond to this differently. Some people engage in attention-getting behavior, take lots of selfies and post about every little thing that they do on social media because they think that everyone is super interested in it. And for others, they think everyone's paying attention to them, and it makes them really anxious. And so some people can kind of shut down and withdraw a little bit at this time. You can think of this in relation to when you give a speech. Do you think that people are focusing on you and your errors and going home considering how you did on your speech? Probably not, right? So people aren't as interested in you as you think they are. And once you understand that, it can be quite liberating because you don't hold yourself to such a high standard. And then the last one, personal fable, the sense of uniqueness, that you are experiencing something that no one else has experienced. No one could possibly understand what you're going through. You see a teenage girl who breaks up with her boyfriend and she says to her mother, "Mom, you just don't understand. This was different." And mom's like, "Yeah, right," and rolls her eyes and knows that her daughter will find someone else fairly shortly, and that this is just a very typical teenager breakup. So you aren't all that unique. And also invincibility, this idea that bad things happen to other people, but you're invincible. So teenagers will engage in a lot of risky behaviors because of this. Drug use, driving fast without their seatbelt on, unprotected sex, thinking, oh, bad things happen to others, but not really to me. So that sense of invincibility. Now, for this formal operational stage, I've mentioned this a couple times before, not every adult reaches this stage. Many adults fail that hypothetical deductive task of having to come up with a hypothesis and collect data and then deduce what factors affect the pendulum. Opportunities to use formal operational reasoning is not consistent across people or across intellectual domains. So thinking abstractly as opposed to concretely is not something that everyone has much experience with. So that wraps up Piaget. Just real quickly, I want to share with you a little bit about Vygotsky's sociocultural perspective. So Vygotsky suggested that we're embedded in a context, and this shapes who we become. And importantly, it's the language that we use as we work with teachers in our lives. And this is kind of a broad idea of teacher. It's not just a teacher who's employed at a school, but your parents can be a teacher as well. Your older siblings can be teachers. Even your friends can be teachers. So he developed this idea of scaffolding and guided participation, that our social experiences and working with others teach children how to think. Guided participation is sensitive teaching in which the teacher is attuned to the needs of the child and helps him accomplish more than he could do alone. So if you give a child a puzzle to do, they may really struggle. But if a parent is there walking them through it and saying, okay, find all of the pieces with edges and find the ones with this color blue, then they're able to put this piece together, the puzzle together, when they couldn't have done that on their own. This is called scaffolding, that assistance that permits the child to bridge that gap between his or her current competence level as well as the task at hand. So it brings a child from what they could do alone to accomplishing more. That gap there is called the zone of proximal development. So the gap between what a child can do and what she can do with assistance. And that assistance is called scaffolding, is walking them through it and giving them prompts and, giving them a model to imitate, right? That's scaffolding. And the scaffolding is eventually decreased over time as children gain the ability to do those skills on their own. So Vygotsky suggested that we have cultural tools. These cultural tools include physical items like computers and pencil and paper, but also ways about thinking of things. And these cultural tools are ways that we learn about the environment and are passed on from one generation to the next. Not every culture carries around a paper and pencil and sits in class in order to learn information. Information can be passed and learned in different ways, not necessarily by taking notes. That's kind of a more culturally specific thing. So, Vygotsky's perspective, it was criticized for lack of precision. The mechanisms or processes underlying the social transmission of thought weren't really described. And it's not easily testable. I mean, how do you test a zone of proximal development? It's not very clear. And lastly, he didn't really pay close attention to these underlying cognitive capacities like attention and memory. They just aren't addressed. So instead, he focused a bit more on the social context and emphasized the importance of teachers around you, but didn't necessarily talk about those underlying capacities. Those who study cognitive development in adulthood examine epistemic cognition, essentially the ways in which individuals understand knowledge and how they arrive at their beliefs and their ideas and these conclusions. So let me just give you a scenario, and this is pretty typical for how we investigate the different ways that people think and reason and use logic, is we give these potential stories, and how would you respond to this particular story? So here's one narrative. And just think about how you would respond to it. John is known to be a heavy drinker, especially when he goes to parties. Mary, John's wife, warns him that if he comes home drunk one more time, she will leave him and take the children. Tonight, John is out late at an office party, and John comes home drunk. Does Mary leave John? Now, I want you to think about your responses. And some of you, might have experience with those who have a drinking problem and will say, yep, nope, that's it. They're never going to change. And some of you may think, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. A child will apply some basic logic and will say, well, she said this was the last time. If it happens one more time, then I'm going to leave him. It happened one more time, so therefore she will leave him. Okay? You see that very basic logic. But with adults, it's not necessarily so black and white, and instead it could be a little bit more complicated in our answers and our solutions. And some of you, might be thinking things like, well, it's pretty difficult to just pick up and leave, and take the kids. Where are they going to stay? Do they have someone that they can be with? Does she have enough money to stay in a hotel room? And, it's more complicated than that. Sometimes people say something and set an ultimatum, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they follow it. So we've got a lot of factors here in the way that people can respond to this particular scenario. And it's that type of talking through problems and coming to conclusions that leads us to these different types of thinking in adult development. So post-formal reasoning, remember formal operations is Piaget's final stage. This is a stage that has been suggested beyond Piaget's theory is post-formal thought. And this thought integrates abstract reasoning, but also practical considerations. It's not just coming up to a logical conclusion, but really in the practical world, what can work and really what is the best solution. Now, we may progress through stages as adults and first begin with dualistic thinking, very polar reasoning in which a person is either right or wrong. So based on facts, but then collecting facts and coming to a conclusion based on those facts. And those who have dualistic thinking have difficulty grasping that there can be several contradictory arguments. And each of these arguments, even though they're contradictory, they can have supporting evidence. This dualistic thinking is sometimes shown in college students who are taught several theories to explain one phenomena. And they say, but which theory is right? And a professor will say, well, neither theory is right or wrong. They both have supporting evidence. And that can be very difficult to deal with, that in this dualistic type of thought, we want a right or a wrong, and then we want to figure out which one is right. Now, relativistic thinking is a little bit different. In this case, we progress to realizing that knowledge is viewed as relative and dependent on the situation itself, dependent on the thinker, that these beliefs are subjective, there are multiple perspectives on a given issue, and that all perspectives are defensible. So we start to say that you know, people think differently, attack the problem differently, and so, you know, each perspective may be correct. There's validity to both perspectives. And then last, the reflective judgment is a reasoning that synthesizes contradictions among perspectives, recognizing that options and opinions can be evaluated and then generates criteria to do so. So now we're going above and beyond just seeing that there are contradictory arguments, but actually judging and evaluating based on criteria which argument has the best supportive evidence and is perhaps the most valid argument. Pragmatic thought is an emphasis in using logic to address everyday problems. And this permits the acceptance of inconsistency and ambiguity, that it's really unclear as to what the best solution is, you know, when it comes to the practical, pragmatic application of thought. And this leads us to cognitive affective complexity, the ability to be aware of emotions and integrate positive and negative feelings about an issue. This increases from early adulthood through late middle adulthood and then declines a little bit later, but it does help people with understanding others' perspectives, feelings, and motivations. So most adults don't actually reach these more advanced levels of reasoning, and it may take even graduate level work to really get people to that point of being able to develop criteria to evaluate arguments and criticize those particular arguments. So it really is quite advanced thought. Also, just some criticisms, you know, the ways in which researchers ask questions can influence responses and then ultimately what is concluded about cognition. So the way that I phrase the question about John and Mary may lead you to come up with a more conclusive answer or be more likely to see, you know, the ambiguity in answers. And then last, you know, this perspective, there's really little explanation for how changes occur. We see that change does occur in thought and the way that we understand our knowledge and come to decisions over time. But how does that happen? What progresses people through those stages? We just really aren't quite sure, need a little bit more research there. All right, hope you've enjoyed learning about cognitive development. Thank you so much.